I never planned to live in a gated community. The manicured lawns and identical facades were everything I had spent my adult life avoiding. But when my grandmother passed away and left me her cottage, I could not resist the call of her memory. "This land has been in our family for generations," she had told me, her fingers tracing the property lines on a faded map. "They built around us, but they never owned us." The cottage sat like a defiant sentinel atop the highest hill in Oak Ridge Estates. Long before the luxury homes and the clubhouse and the community pool, my grandmother's family had owned this entire hillside. 100 acres of woodland eventually sold off, piece by piece, until only the cottage and its surrounding 3 acres remained, a stubborn reminder of what this place had been before progress marched through. From my kitchen window, I could see the entire planned community sprawled below. Modern homes with Spanish tile roofs, perfectly spaced trees, community garden plots assigned by lottery. It was beautiful in its sterility. My cottage, with its hand-carved shutters and slightly crooked chimney, stood in direct contrast to everything the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association represented. I knew there would be tension when I moved in. The realtor had warned me about the infamous Karen Whitfield, HOA president for 15 consecutive years. "She runs this place like her personal fiefdom," he had said in a hushed tone. "And your grandmother's cottage has been a thorn in her side for decades." I dismissed his concerns. I was not interested in neighborhood politics. I just wanted peace, a place to write my novel, and the comfort of being surrounded by my grandmother's possessions. Her books, her quilts, the cedar chest filled with letters from my grandfather during the war. These were treasures no homeowners association could ever understand. The first violation notice arrived exactly 3 days after I moved in. It was taped to my front door in a red envelope marked urgent. "Dear resident," it began, "the following violations have been observed at your property and must be remedied within 72 hours to avoid penalties. Chipped paint on eastern-facing shutters, unauthorized garden ornaments, gnomes, non-standard mailbox, excessive wildflowers in yard area." I crumpled the notice and tossed it in my kitchen trash. The next morning I found another one, and the day after that another, each with increasingly trivial complaints. When I finally met Karen in person, it was at the monthly HOA meeting I had reluctantly attended. She stood at a podium in the community center, a woman in her mid-50s with aggressively blonde hair cut into what my grandmother would have called a power bob. Her voice carried the practiced authority of someone who had never been successfully challenged. "As for the continuing eyesore on the North Hill," she said, pointing to a photograph of my cottage projected onto a screen, "we are exploring all legal avenues to bring this property into compliance. The board agrees that its current condition decreases neighboring property values by an estimated 12%. I raised my hand. The room fell silent. "That eyesore has been there for 70 years, I said, keeping my voice steady. "Long before there was an Oak Ridge Estates. My grandmother built it herself. I inherited it, and I have no intention of turning it into whatever beige monstrosity would make you happy." Karen's smile never reached her eyes. "We all have to follow the rules, Mr. Anderson. No exceptions." That night I began documenting everything. I installed security cameras around my property. I saved every notice, every email. I photographed my cottage daily, creating a record of its true condition versus the imagined violations Karen insisted existed. I was not going to be bullied out of my home. Not by her. Not by anyone. What I did not realize then was that this was only the beginning of a war I never asked for. A war that would eventually cost me everything I loved about my grandmother's cottage. but would reveal a power I never knew I had. On my darkest days, I would sit on the porch swing, looking out over the community that despised my existence, and wonder what my grandmother would have done. She had resisted their pressure for decades. Now it was my turn to stand my ground. I just never imagined how brutal the battle would become. The mailbox became the first casualty in Corinne's crusade against my existence. I returned home one afternoon to find it missing, a note taped to the post. Removed per HOA Regulation 17.3, non-compliant mailboxes. I called the HOA office immediately. "This is theft," I told the receptionist. "I want my property returned." "I will relay your concerns to the board," she replied mechanically. "In the meantime, approved mailboxes can be purchased through our vendor for $249.99. $250 for a mailbox. I installed a simple wooden one instead, hand-painted with wildflowers, a deliberate act of defiance. It lasted exactly 2 days before disappearing again. Corinne's tactics grew more aggressive with each passing week. Violation notices appeared with mathematical precision, Monday mornings and Thursday afternoons. The imaginary infractions became increasingly absurd. Unapproved wildflower species in North Garden bed. Wind chimes exceed permissible ambient noise levels. Unauthorized bird feeder attracting non-indigenous species. Each notice carried a fine, ranging from $50 to $200. I refused to pay them, sending certified letters contesting each violation with photographic evidence. The fines began to accumulate. Letters arrived threatening liens against my property. One Tuesday morning, I awoke to find an official-looking document posted to my front door. Notice of zoning violation, illegal structure. The shed where my grandmother had done her pottery for 30 years was suddenly deemed non-compliant with updated community standards. I was given 14 days to demolish it. That afternoon, I sought help from a property attorney. Susan Chen listened patiently as I laid out the increasingly hostile actions of the HOA. "They cannot just arbitrarily change zoning to target your property," she said, reviewing my documents. "Especially since your land was established before the HOA existed. There is something called grandfathered status that should protect you." We filed a cease and desist order against the HOA. I paid for an official land survey to establish the exact boundaries of my property. The results were illuminating. According to the survey, the HOA had placed several of their sprinkler systems and one corner of their decorative fence on my land, without permission. When I brought this to Corinne's attention, her expression hardened into something ugly. "You do not understand how things work here," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "This community has standards. Your grandmother was tolerated because of her age. You will not receive the same courtesy." The following week, bright orange flyers appeared on every door in Oak Ridge Estates. "Community Safety Alert. Nuisance Property Identified." My address was printed in bold letters, alongside vague accusations of multiple violations endangering neighborhood wellness and obstruction of community beautification efforts. Neighbors began to avoid me at the local grocery store. Joggers crossed to the other side of the road when passing my property. Children were told not to walk near my cottage. I had become the community pariah based on nothing but Corinne's vindictive campaign. The stress began affecting my daily life. I lost focus on my writing. Sleep became elusive. Each day brought new anxieties about what might be waiting for me when I returned home. I installed additional security cameras and motion detectors, feeling increasingly like a prisoner in my own home. I spent evenings researching HOA law, learning about the limits of their power and the rights of homeowners. I joined online forums where others shared similar experiences of HOA abuse. I discovered patterns, targeting non-conforming properties, escalating fines to force compliance, using social pressure to isolate resistors. This was not random harassment. This was a systematic campaign to force me out. "You should consider selling," my neighbor Tom whispered one day as we collected our mail. "Karen will not stop until she gets what she wants. She did the same thing to the Johnsons last year. Their modern architecture did not fit her vision. They sold at a loss just to escape." I shook my head. "This land means too much to me. I am not going anywhere." What I did not say was that a plan was already forming in my mind. Not a plan of surrender, but of resistance. My grandmother had not raised me to back down from bullies, and I was beginning to understand that this was not just about paint colors or garden gnomes. This was about power, and I was just starting to realize I might have more of it than Corinne knew. The call came at 8:37 p.m. on a Thursday evening. I was at a coffee shop downtown, working on my novel, when my phone lit up with a number I did not recognize. "Mr. Anderson," the voice was official, urgent. "This is Lieutenant Peters from the Oak Ridge Fire Department. You need to come home immediately. There has been a fire at your residence." Time seemed to slow as I drove up the winding road to my cottage. The flashing lights of emergency vehicles painted the trees in surreal bursts of red and blue. From a quarter-mile away, I could see the smoke billowing against the night sky, thick and black and final. I abandoned my car on the shoulder and ran the remaining distance, my heart hammering against my ribs. Police barricades blocked the final approach to my property. Through gaps in the emergency vehicles, I caught glimpses of the devastation. The eastern wall of the cottage had collapsed entirely. The roof was gone. Water from fire hoses turned the garden into a muddy wasteland. "My grandmother's cottage," I whispered to no one, "everything she built." A firefighter approached, his face streaked with soot. "We managed to save the western rooms, but the damage is extensive. I am sorry." "How did it start?" I asked, my voice hollow. "We cannot say definitively yet. The investigation team will need to." "I smell gasoline," I interrupted. The firefighter hesitated. "There are indicators of an accelerant. The fire marshal has requested an arson investigation." As if summoned by the word arson, a black SUV pulled up to the barricade. Corinne stepped out, dressed immaculately despite the late hour. She spoke briefly to a police officer, who nodded and lifted the tape for her to duck under. She approached a cluster of HOA board members who had gathered to witness the destruction. "Simply terrible," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the chaos. "We have been warning about fire hazards at this property for months. All those old wooden structures. It was a disaster waiting to happen." Our eyes met across the devastation of my home. For just a moment, the mask slipped. The corner of her mouth twitched upward, a fleeting ghost of satisfaction, before she rearranged her features into an expression of appropriate concern. I knew then. I knew with absolute certainty. The fire marshal confirmed my suspicion 3 days later. Traces of accelerant had been found at multiple ignition points around the cottage. This was no accident, no electrical failure. Someone had deliberately destroyed my home. Yet when I presented the security footage from my cameras showing Corinne's SUV circling my property just 30 minutes before the first flames were spotted, the police deemed it inconclusive. The vehicle cannot be positively identified, the detective explained. The license plate is not visible, and circling a neighbor's property while suspicious is not evidence of arson. At the emergency HOA meeting called to address the unfortunate incident, Karen performed her role flawlessly. She expressed profound sorrow for my loss. She established a neighborhood watch committee to prevent further tragedies. She even proposed a community fundraiser to help with my rebuilding costs, a suggestion that was quickly tabled when another matter required the board's attention. Through it all, she never looked directly at me, not once. I sat silent in the back row, watching the performance, the careful construction of her public persona, the practiced empathy that never reached her eyes. I watched the board members nod along, complicit in their silence. I watched my neighbors accept her version of events without question. That night in the hotel room where I now lived, I spread the security footage across my laptop screen. Frame by frame, I analyzed every second. There, at the edge of the frame, visible for only a moment as the SUV turned, a flash of blonde hair. And there, an arm extending from the driver's window, dropping something onto my property line before speeding away. Not enough to convince the police, not enough for an arrest, but enough for me to know the truth. I pulled out the old metal box I had salvaged from the ruins. Miraculously, the fire had not reached the cellar where my grandmother kept her most important documents. Inside the box lay the history of our land, deeds, surveys, water rights, easements, the legal proof of what this property had once been, and what it still controlled. My hands shook as I unfolded the oldest document. My grandmother had shown it to me once, explaining that it might someday be important. I had not understood its significance then. I understood now. Karen had taken everything from me. My home, my grandmother's legacy, my sense of safety. But in doing so, she had unknowingly freed me from any obligation to be reasonable, to be a good neighbor, to play by the rules of a game that was rigged against me from the start. "You built your castle on my foundation," I whispered to the document in my hands. "Time to see how it stands when I pull it away." The county record's office smelled of dust and forgotten promises. I had been there for 6 hours, methodically working my way through property archives dating back to the 1940s. The clerk, an older woman named Margaret, watched with increasing curiosity as I filled page after page with notes. "Most people give up after the first hour," she commented, bringing me another stack of property maps. "You must really need to find something." "I need the truth," I replied. The truth was buried in plat maps and water surveys, in easement agreements and developmental permits, in the skeletal framework of legal documents that formed the invisible foundation of Oak Ridge Estates. My grandmother's land had once encompassed the entire hillside and the valley below. When developers purchased the surrounding acres in the 1990s, they had not simply built houses, they had reconstructed the entire landscape, regraded the slopes, redirected natural drainage, installed infrastructure where once there had been only forest. But one crucial element had remained unchanged: water. The natural spring that originated on my property had been cleverly incorporated into the community's water system. Engineering documents revealed an elaborate network of pipes and pumps that channeled water from my hillside into their community reservoir. Additional records showed municipal water as a supplementary source, meaning the HOA relied primarily on my spring to keep their community pools filled, their golf course green, and their ornamental fountains flowing. It was ingenious, it was efficient, and according to the water rights documentation still registered in my grandmother's name, it was entirely illegal. My grandmother had never granted permanent water rights to the development. She had allowed a temporary easement during construction, an easement that had expired 15 years ago. The HOA had simply continued using the water, likely assuming the elderly woman would never notice or challenge them. I contacted 3 different water rights attorneys before finding one who specialized in exactly this type of case. Elaine Watkins reviewed my documents with the focused attention of a surgeon. "They have been stealing your water for 15 years, she confirmed, tapping the expired easement document. "And in this state, water rights are extraordinarily valuable, especially with the drought conditions we have been experiencing." "Can I shut it off?" I asked, "legally?" She nodded slowly. "The spring originates on your property. The easement has expired. You have every legal right to control access to that water. And if that means cutting off the primary water supply to 200 homes." Elaine removed her glasses. "That would be an unfortunate consequence for the homeowners, one the HOA should have considered before allowing the easement to expire, one they definitely should have addressed before antagonizing the person who controls their water supply." I sat back, the weight of this leverage settling over me. I need to see exactly how the system works. The next day, I hired a water systems engineer to locate the main connection point between my spring and the community supply. Under the guise of routine maintenance, he identified the junction box buried at the edge of my property. He explained how the system functioned, how water flowed from the natural spring through a series of filters and pumps before joining the community supply. And most importantly, he showed me where a shut-off valve could be installed, one that would require a key I alone would possess. Throughout this investigation, Karen continued her campaign against me. With my cottage now a charred shell, she focused on new violations. The construction debris needed to be removed immediately. The temporary fence around the ruins violated height restrictions. The portable storage container where I kept my salvaged belongings was an unauthorized structure. Each letter, each new demand, only strengthened my resolve. I scheduled the installation of the shut-off valve for the following Tuesday, coincidentally, the same day as the monthly HOA board meeting. I had the property line resurveyed and marked with official stakes. I filed updated water rights documentation with the county recorder. Every step legal, every move documented, every action building toward the moment when Karen would discover that her perfect community existed entirely at my mercy. The night before the installation, I stood at the edge of my property, looking down at the twinkling lights of Oak Ridge Estates. The community pool glowed blue in the darkness. Sprinklers hissed across perfect lawns. In the central plaza, the 3-tiered fountain sparkled under decorative lighting. "All of it running on my water," I whispered, "not for much longer." The morning arrived with the heavy stillness that precedes momentous change. I watched from my rental car as the utility crew installed the industrial-grade shut-off valve at the critical junction where my spring water entered the community system. They worked efficiently, their uniform trucks bearing no company name, a precaution I had insisted upon. "All set," the foreman said, handing me a brass key. "This system now requires manual authorization to function. Without this key, no water flows from your property to the community lines." I had spent the previous day preparing. Large signs now stood at regular intervals along my property line. "Private water source, unauthorized access prohibited," and "Notice of termination of water easement effective immediately." I had sent certified letters to every member of the HOA board, the property management company, and the city water authority. Each letter meticulously outlined the legal basis for my action, the history of the expired easement, and my right to control access to water originating on my property. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. at the community center. I arrived early, taking a seat in the back row. Residents filed in, nodding to each other, completely unaware that their comfortable existence balanced on a knife edge of my creation. Karen entered precisely at 6:55, her leather portfolio clutched to her chest like a shield. She arranged her materials at the podium, tapping the microphone with manicured fingernails. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending tonight's Homeowners Association meeting. We have several important items on the agenda." I checked my watch. 7:02 p.m. I sent a text message to the utility foreman waiting at the valve. "Proceed." Karen continued her announcements, detailing upcoming community events and maintenance schedules. I watched the clock on the wall. 3 minutes passed. 4, 5. Then it started. A woman's phone chimed with a text message. She checked it, then leaned over to whisper to her husband. A man in the front row received a call, stepping out to answer it. The community manager slipped into the room, her face flushed with alarm, and hurried to Karen's side. Karen's expression changed as she read the note handed to her. Confusion, disbelief, the first flickers of panic. "Excuse me," she said, her voice suddenly tight. "It appears we have a maintenance issue that requires immediate attention. We will take a brief recess." "Is it about the water?" Someone called from the middle of the room. "My wife just texted that nothing is coming out of our taps." Murmurs spread through the room. More phones chimed with alerts. "The fountain in the plaza just stopped working." "My sprinkler system shut down mid-cycle." "The pool pumps are failing." Karen's eyes scanned the room, finally landing on me in the back row. I met her gaze steadily, allowing myself the smallest of smiles. "This is a temporary issue," she assured the increasingly restless crowd. "We have backup municipal water connections that should activate automatically." "They will not," I said, standing up. My voice carried across the now silent room. "The municipal connection is designed as a supplementary source. It cannot handle the full demand of the community." Every head turned toward me. Karen's face drained of color. "What have you done?" she demanded. I walked slowly to the front of the room, placing my documentation on the table beside her podium. The certified letters, the expired easement, the water rights registry, the engineering diagrams showing how their entire community had been built around a water source they did not own. "I have reclaimed what is legally mine," I said, my voice calm despite the hammering of my heart. "For 15 years, this HOA has been stealing water that originates on my property, water that belonged to my grandmother and now belongs to me." The room erupted in shouts and questions. Karen attempted to regain control, banging her gavel repeatedly against the podium. "This is extortion," she shouted. "This is illegal." "No," I corrected her, sliding the expired easement document toward her. "This is justice. When my home burned to the ground under suspicious circumstances, I started investigating what was really happening in this community. What I found was theft on a massive scale. Systematic, deliberate theft of a natural resource that belongs to me." I turned to address the room, now silent with shock. "Every one of you received legal notice this morning. Your HOA has been operating outside the law, and now you are experiencing the consequences." Karen's face contorted with rage. "You cannot do this. We will sue you into oblivion." I smiled, feeling truly in control for the first time since moving into my grandmother's cottage. I look forward to explaining in court how you burned down my home. The water stays off until new terms are negotiated. My attorney will be in touch. As I walked out of the stunned silent room, I heard the first drops of rain begin to hit the roof. A meaningless coincidence, but it felt like validation from the universe itself. Chaos has a rhythm all its own. The days following my action against the HOA unfolded in a symphony of escalating consequences. First came the practical problems: 200 households without adequate water, toilets that would not flush, showers that trickled instead of flowed, swimming pools growing murky in the summer heat. Then came the anger. An emergency community meeting was called in the park, neutral territory. Residents gathered in the growing dusk, their faces illuminated by phone flashlights and portable lanterns. Karen stood at the center of the tempest, her composure cracking under the weight of collective outrage. "We are pursuing every legal avenue," she shouted over the crowd. "This terrorist action against our community will not stand." "Why did our water come from his property in the first place?" someone called out. "Why did the easement expire without renewal?" asked another. "How much would it cost to connect solely to municipal water?" Questions Karen could not, or would not, answer. Questions that revealed the foundation of doubt now undermining her authority. I watched from a distance, observing as the community I had been ostracized from turned its scrutiny inward. The HOA board members, once a unified front behind Karen, began to distance themselves. The vice president resigned the following day, citing personal reasons. The treasurer requested an emergency audit of the HOA finances. That audit became the second crack in Karen's facade. Preliminary findings revealed years of questionable expenditures. Community funds allocated for administrative consulting that traced back to a company owned by Karen's husband. Landscaping contracts awarded exclusively to her brother-in-law's business at rates well above market value. The replacement of perfectly functional clubhouse furniture with luxury pieces that later turned up in Karen's home, documented in her own social media posts. Local news caught wind of the story. Water war in luxury community began as a human interest piece but quickly evolved into an investigation of HOA corruption. Reporters camped at the community entrance, interviewing residents about their experiences under Karen's leadership. The stories poured out like water from a broken dam. She fined me $500 for planting unlicensed rose bushes, one elderly resident revealed. When I could not pay, she put a lien on my home. "My son is autistic and needs a specific swing set for sensory regulation," another shared. She called it an unauthorized play structure and threatened daily fines until we removed it. She had my car towed from my own driveway because it was an unapproved color that decreased property values, a young father recounted. The pattern was unmistakable. Years of petty tyranny, unchecked power, and financial exploitation, all beneath the veneer of maintaining community standards. Karen attempted to regain control of the narrative. She filed for a temporary restraining order against me, claiming I was endangering public health. The judge dismissed it within hours, pointing out that I had provided clear legal notice and was exercising documented water rights. She organized a campaign to discredit me in the media, distributing photographs of my burned cottage, with captions suggesting I had neglected the property. Anonymous comments appeared on news articles claiming I was mentally unstable, dangerous, untrustworthy. But the tide had turned. Even her most loyal supporters began to question her judgment as property values plummeted, and real estate agents refused to list homes in a community with an uncertain water supply. 10 days after I turned the valve, I received my first visitor from the neighborhood. Thomas Edwards, a retired judge who had lived in Oak Ridge Estates for 8 years. He approached my temporary trailer cautiously, as though crossing an invisible boundary. "I owe you an apology," he said, extending his hand. "I witnessed how Karen targeted your property and said nothing. Many of us knew she was out of control, but it was easier to keep our heads down." More followed. A young couple with a newborn, worried about bathing their child with bottled water. A retired teacher who had faced Karen's wrath over unauthorized bird feeders. A businessman who had uncovered financial discrepancies in the HOA budget years ago, only to be silenced with threats of litigation. Each brought stories. Each brought apologies. And most importantly, each brought a willingness to create something new from the ruins of what Karen had built. The final blow came when the city opened a formal investigation into the HOA's financial practices. Karen's personal bank records were subpoenaed. Former board members were interviewed under oath about decision-making processes. Faced with the collapse of her carefully constructed kingdom, Karen did what tyrants throughout history have done when confronted with their own accountability. She ran. The resignation letter, sent via email to all residents, cited health concerns and personal priorities as reasons for her immediate departure from the board. Within days, a "for sale" sign appeared in front of her home. The Queen had fallen, and in her absence, a community discovered it had the power to rebuild itself. Spring arrived, painting the hillside with new life. Where my grandmother's cottage had stood, a new foundation emerged from the earth. Not identical to the original, nothing could replace that legacy, but something honest and strong and wholly mine. I stood on the bare wooden subfloor, watching the sunset cast long shadows across the valley below. 6 months had passed since the night of the fire. 6 months of transformation, for both the land and its people. The reconstruction was a community effort, not because of obligation or guilt, but because of a genuine desire to heal the wounds Karen had inflicted on all of us. Every weekend, volunteers appeared with tools and materials. Retired contractors supervised amateur carpenters. Teenagers helped install insulation. Families delivered homemade lunches to the worksite. Thomas Edwards, the retired judge, had become the interim HOA president. Under his leadership, the old board was dissolved entirely. A new council formed, with term limits and transparent financial practices. Monthly meetings were now held outdoors, weather permitting, in a circle where every voice carried equal weight. "We are rebuilding more than your home," Thomas told me one afternoon, as we reviewed the architectural plans. "We are rebuilding trust, something Karen destroyed more thoroughly than any fire could." The water issue had been resolved through careful negotiation. My attorney had drafted a proper legal agreement granting Oak Ridge Estates access to the spring water at fair market value. The proceeds would be held in trust for maintenance of the natural area surrounding the spring, now officially designated as protected land that could never be developed. Around the spring itself, I had installed a permanent fence with an educational display explaining the watershed system and the importance of conservation. School groups visited regularly, learning how a single water source could support an entire ecosystem when respected and protected. Karen was gone. Her house sold at a significant loss to a family with 3 young children who immediately painted the front door a cheerful shade of yellow, a color she would have found appalling. I heard rumors she had relocated to a high-rise condo in another state. No yard to maintain, no community to control. The formal investigation into the HOA's finances under her leadership continued. Early findings suggested that over $300,000 had been misappropriated over the years. Restitution would be made to the community, but the deeper damage to trust could not be so easily repaired. As my new home took shape, I found myself becoming the unofficial historian of Oak Ridge Estates. Residents who had lived under Karen's regime for years sought me out, sharing stories of how the community had changed over time, how something beautiful had slowly twisted into something toxic. She was not always like that, one longtime resident explained. When she first joined the board, she genuinely wanted to improve things, but power changed her. Year by year, rule by rule, she built a system where she was untouchable. I understood now why my grandmother had kept herself apart from the community while still caring deeply for the land. She had recognized something fundamental about power and those who seek it, about the fragility of systems built on fear rather than mutual respect. On the anniversary of the fire, I hosted a gathering at my newly completed home. Not a housewarming, but a community healing ceremony. We planted native trees around the perimeter of my property, not as a boundary, but as a connection between the wildness of my land and the cultivated beauty of the community below. As twilight fell, we released paper lanterns into the night sky, one for each household, carrying messages of hope and intention for the future we would build together. Standing on my porch, watching the lanterns rise like earthbound stars, I felt my grandmother's presence beside me. Her wisdom had guided me through the darkest days. Her courage had given me strength when I wanted to abandon this place forever. "Your cottage is beautiful," Thomas said, joining me at the railing. "Different from before, but somehow right for this place." "It has good bones," I replied, using my grandmother's favorite phrase, "and a clear view of what matters." Below us, the community glowed with warmth and life. Children played in yards without fear of violation notices. Gardens flourished with indigenous plants that required minimal watering. The community fountain now operated on a timer, conserving the precious resource we all now understood was finite and shared. The spring continued to flow from my land to theirs, no longer stolen, but given with clear boundaries and mutual respect. The water tasted sweeter for being acknowledged rather than taken. The community thrived not despite limitations, but because of them. I had lost my inherited home to fire and hatred, but in its place, I had built something stronger, a home of my own choosing, on land that would never again be violated, with neighbors who had learned the hard way that true community is built on respect, not rules. My grandmother would have approved. This was her land, these were her values, and now they were truly mine. My land, my rules, my peace at last.